There are places in the Pacific Northwest where the forest doesn't just grow, it consumes, where the canopy blocks out the sky so completely that noon feels like twilight, and the silence isn't peaceful, it's watchful. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington is one of those places. Nearly 1.4 million acres of old-growth Douglas fir, western hemlock, and cedars so ancient they were standing when Lewis and Clark first mapped the Columbia River. It's beautiful in the way that wild things are beautiful, vast, indifferent, and utterly unforgiving to those who underestimate it. Marcus Davenport understood that, or at least everyone thought he did. He wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. Friends described him as cautious to the point of being neurotic, the kind of person who read weather reports 3 days in advance and carried emergency flares even on day hikes. He'd grown up in the suburbs of Seattle, but spent his 20s falling in love with topography, with the way elevation lines told stories about land that most people never noticed. By the time he entered his graduate program at the University of Washington, studying historical cartography and geographic information systems, he'd already logged hundreds of solo trail miles across the Cascades. He knew how to read terrain. He knew how to stay safe. That's what made his disappearance so impossible to understand. October 14th, 2021. A Thursday. Marcus had told his roommate, Stephen Chen, that he was heading out for a 2-day mapping project in the Gifford-Pinchot, focusing on abandoned logging roads from the 1930s that weren't properly documented in modern databases. It was the kind of obscure academic work that excited Marcus but bored most other people to tears. He'd packed his usual gear, tent, sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, water filtration system, 5 days of freeze-dried meals, first aid kit, satellite GPS unit, backup paper maps, and his prized possession, a weatherproof map case containing hand-drawn route surveys he'd been compiling for his thesis. Stephen remembered watching him load the Subaru that morning. Marcus had seemed focused, maybe a little distracted, but not worried, not scared. He'd mentioned something about finding references to an old trail system in forestry records from 1937, paths that had been used by logging crews before the roads went in, trails that didn't appear on any contemporary maps. He wanted to see if any trace of them still existed, hidden under decades of undergrowth and forest reclamation. "I'll be back Saturday afternoon," Marcus had said, adjusting his glasses in that habitual way he had, pushing them up the bridge of his nose with his index finger. "If I'm not back by Sunday morning, you know the drill." The drill meant calling search and rescue. It meant something had gone seriously wrong. Sunday morning came. Marcus didn't. Stephen waited until noon, hoping his friend had just lost track of time, gotten absorbed in his mapping work, and decided to stay an extra night. But by 2 in the afternoon, when Marcus still wasn't answering his phone and hadn't responded to any texts, Stephen called the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. By 4 o'clock, a deputy had located Marcus's Subaru at the end of Forest Road 2160, a deteriorating gravel track that snaked 15 miles into the southeastern quadrant of the Gifford-Pinchot, before dead-ending at a forgotten trailhead that hadn't seen official maintenance since the Clinton administration. The car was locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. Inside, deputies found Marcus's phone charger, a half-empty bag of trail mix, and a University of Washington parking permit dangling from the rearview mirror. What they didn't find was Marcus's pack, his tent, his GPS unit, or any indication of which direction he'd headed when he left the vehicle. The official search began Monday morning, October 18th. Skamania County Search and Rescue deployed 3 teams with dogs, supported by volunteers from the Cascade chapter of the Mountain Rescue Association. The weather was cooperating, cold but clear, temperatures in the low 40s, no rain forecasted for the next 72 hours. Conditions were about as good as they get for a search operation in October. The dogs picked up Marcus's scent immediately, tracking west from the trailhead along what remained of an old footpath, barely visible under years of fallen needles and rotting logs. The trail, if it could still be called that, followed a ridgeline for roughly 2 miles before descending into a drainage basin choked with devil's club and vine maple. After 3 miles, the scent trail became confused, circling back on itself several times before fading entirely near a seasonal creek that, in October, was nothing more than a trickle over moss-covered stones. That's where the search dogs stopped, all 3 of them. They circled the creek bed, whining, visibly agitated, refusing to cross the water, even though it was barely 6 inches deep. Their handlers had never seen anything quite like it. Trained search dogs don't just quit. They don't refuse to follow a scent without reason. But these dogs wanted nothing to do with whatever lay on the other side of that creek. The handlers pushed forward anyway, carrying the dogs across the water, trying to re-establish the scent on the far bank. Nothing. It was as if Marcus Davenport had simply ceased to exist the moment he crossed that stream. No scent trail, no footprints in the soft mud, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation indicating someone had pushed through the undergrowth. Just dense, silent forest that swallowed all evidence of his passage. Over the next 2 weeks, the search expanded to cover nearly 40 square miles. They brought in helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. They deployed ground teams in grid patterns, searching quadrant by methodical quadrant. They checked every abandoned logging camp, every hunter's shelter, every cave and rock overhang within a 10-mile radius of where the scent trail had vanished. The local news ran his photograph. Social media pages dedicated to missing hikers shared his information thousands of times. Tips came in, dozens of them, but none led anywhere meaningful. Marcus's parents, Richard and Linda Davenport, drove down from Bellingham and stayed at a motel in Stevenson, spending their days at the search command post, their nights staring at maps and trying to understand how their careful, intelligent son could vanish so completely. His father kept asking the same question over and over. How does someone just disappear? In this day and age, with GPS and cell towers and satellites, how? But the Gifford Pinchot isn't like other places. Cell coverage is spotty at best, non-existent in the deeper valleys. GPS units fail when batteries die or when you drop them crossing a creek. Satellites can't see through old-growth canopy thick enough to block out the sun. And the forest itself is riddled with ravines and caves and deadfall so dense you could walk within 20 feet of someone and never know they were there. By early November, when the first serious storms of the season rolled in, the official search was scaled back to periodic sweeps. Marcus Davenport was reclassified from a rescue operation to a recovery operation, though no one wanted to say those words out loud to his parents. The assumption, unspoken but understood, was that he'd suffered some kind of accident, a fall maybe, or a medical emergency, and that his body would eventually be found by hunters or hikers in the years to come. It happened sometimes. The forest kept its secrets until it was ready to give them back. Weeks became months. Months became years. Marcus's face faded from the news cycle, replaced by other tragedies, other mysteries. His parents never stopped searching. They hired private investigators. They organized volunteer searches every spring and fall, small groups of dedicated people who believed that someone, somewhere, might spot something the official teams had missed. His mother created a Facebook page that she updated religiously, posting about every search effort, every tiny scrap of information, every moment she thought might lead to answers, but the forest gave them nothing, until 3 years later, when it gave them something impossible. April 23, 2024. A group of fishermen working the East Fork Lewis River, about 12 miles northwest of where Marcus's car had been found, stumbled across something wedged between 2 rocks at the edge of a creek bed. It was a waterproof map case, the kind serious hikers use, made of heavy-duty plastic with a bright orange exterior designed to be visible in low light. The case was scratched and dirty but intact, and when one of the fishermen opened it, he found maps inside, hand-drawn maps, annotated in careful blue and red ink, with elevation markers and coordinate notations, and the kind of precise detail that only someone with serious cartography training would include. The fisherman, a retired logger named Dale Hendricks, had been following Marcus's case for years. He recognized the name written on the inside cover of the map case immediately. He called the Skamania County Sheriff's Office before he even finished examining what he'd found. Detective Sarah Voss, who'd been assigned to Marcus's case from the beginning, drove out to the creek the same afternoon. She's a compact woman in her mid-40s, with short dark hair and the kind of weathered face that speaks to decades spent outdoors in all weather. When I spoke to her about the case, she described holding that map case in her hands and feeling something she hadn't felt in years of law enforcement work, genuine chills running down her spine. It wasn't just that we'd found something belonging to Marcus after 3 years, she said, choosing her words carefully. It was where we found it, And what was inside? The location made no sense. 12 miles northwest, across terrain that included 2 significant ridge systems and several deep ravines. Not the kind of distance someone covers casually, not the direction the scent dogs had tracked, and certainly not a place that had been searched in the initial weeks after Marcus disappeared. The area where the map case was discovered was accessible but remote, the kind of spot that only fishermen and the occasional elk hunter ever visited. But it was the contents of the map case that raised questions no one could answer. Inside, along with several standard topographic maps of the Gifford Pinchot, was a hand-drawn map clearly created by Marcus himself. His handwriting was in the notations, his characteristic drafting style in the clean lines and careful symbols. The map showed terrain that matched the southeastern section of the forest where he'd disappeared. The ridge lines were correct, the creek systems accurate, the elevation contours precisely rendered. But there was a trail marked on the map that didn't exist. It was drawn in red ink, distinct from the other markings. The trail started near where Marcus's car had been found, followed the ridge west for several miles, then turned sharply north, crossing the creek where the search dogs had lost his scent. From there, the red line continued north and slightly east, winding through valleys and over smaller ridges, marked with distance notations and elevation changes, detailed as if Marcus had physically walked every foot of it and recorded what he found. The trail, according to his map, ran for nearly 14 miles before ending at a symbol Marcus had drawn and labeled in neat block letters. Old camp, structure remains. Detective Voss spent hours comparing Marcus's hand-drawn map to every official map, every satellite image, every historical survey they could find. The terrain he'd drawn was accurate. The geographic features matched reality. But the trail itself, that carefully documented path marked in red ink, appeared on no other map in existence. Not on current USGS topographic surveys, not on Forest Service maps, not even on the old logging company maps from the 1930s that Marcus had supposedly been researching. According to every official record, the trail Marcus had mapped didn't exist, had never existed. At first we thought maybe he'd just drawn a proposed route, Detective Voss explained. Something he planned to explore, a path he wanted to follow. But that didn't make sense either. Why mark it so precisely? Why include elevation data and distance markers for a trail you haven't actually walked? There was another detail that troubled her. The map case had been found 12 miles from the trailhead. Yes, but it was roughly 8 miles along the route that Marcus had drawn in red ink. 8 miles following a trail that officially didn't exist. A new search operation was organized immediately, focused entirely on the area shown on Marcus's map. If he'd somehow followed that route, if he'd made it to the location he'd marked as Old Camp, then maybe, after 3 years, they might finally find answers. The search team that deployed in late April 2024 was smaller than the original operation but more focused. Detective Voss led it personally, accompanied by 2 experienced trackers from the Mountain Rescue Association and a Forest Service ranger named Thomas Whitmore, who'd worked in the Gifford Pinchot for 26 years and knew the terrain better than almost anyone alive. They started at the trailhead where Marcus's Subaru had been found, following the route marked on his hand-drawn map. For the first 2 miles they followed the remnants of an old trail, the same path the search dogs had tracked 3 years earlier. But when they reached the point where Marcus's map showed the red trail turning north toward the creek, something strange became apparent. There was a trail there, faint, nearly invisible under years of overgrowth, but definitely there. Not an animal trail. The width was wrong, and the way it cut through the vegetation showed signs of human clearing, probably decades old. The kind of trail that had once been maintained but had been abandoned so long that the forest had nearly reclaimed it. Ranger Whitmore stopped when he saw it, frowning. "I've worked this area for over 2 decades, he said slowly. "I've never seen this before. It's not on any map. It's not marked as a historical trail. I didn't know it was here." They followed it. The trail was difficult to track, disappearing entirely in some sections, but Marcus's map was remarkably accurate. When they reached the creek where the search dogs had refused to cross 3 years earlier, they found the trail continuing on the other side exactly where Marcus had drawn it. They crossed the water, barely ankle-deep in April, and pushed north into terrain that none of them had explored before. The forest changed as they went deeper. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks so massive that 3 people couldn't have joined hands around them. The undergrowth thinned out in the deep shade, leaving the forest floor carpeted in rust-colored needles and scattered with decaying logs the size of cars. Sound behaved differently here. Their voices seemed muffled, absorbed by the trees before they could carry more than a few dozen feet. The normal sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, were absent. It felt, Detective Voss said later, like walking through a cathedral, beautiful, ancient, and profoundly unsettling. They'd been following Marcus's trail for roughly 6 hours when one of the trackers noticed something odd. There were marks on some of the trees, 10 or 11 feet above the ground. Long, parallel gouges in the bark, deep enough to expose the pale wood underneath. The marks were weathered, old, but still visible. "Bear?" Detective Voss asked. The tracker shook his head slowly. "Wrong height? Black bears scratch lower, usually 6 or 7 feet at most. Grizzlies might reach that high, but there haven't been confirmed grizzlies in this part of Washington in decades." "Elk, then," Ranger Whitmore suggested. "Bull elk will rub their antlers on trees." "Maybe." But the tracker didn't sound convinced. Elk rub marks looked different, more like abrasion than gouging. These marks looked deliberate, almost carved. They continued following the trail as afternoon faded toward evening. According to Marcus's map, the old camp he'd marked should be less than 2 miles ahead. They were discussing whether to push on or make camp for the night when they rounded a bend and found something that stopped all of them in their tracks. There were footprints in a patch of soft earth near a seasonal spring. Human footprints, probably. Boot treads, definitely. But they were old, partially filled with debris, impossible to date with any certainty. They could have been made 3 years ago. They could have been made 30 years ago. What disturbed the searchers wasn't the footprints themselves. It was what was next to them. Other prints, larger, much larger, pressed deep into the mud, indicating significant weight. The shape was wrong for bear, too elongated, too narrow. Wrong for elk or deer. No hoof structure and far too large anyway. They weren't clear enough to make out distinct features, just impressions that suggested something big and heavy had walked through this spot, parallel to the human tracks, moving in the same direction. Detective Voss photographed everything. They took measurements. They collected soil samples. And as the light faded and the temperature dropped, they set up camp less than a quarter mile from the spring, building a fire that seemed smaller and more fragile than it should have, against the dark wall of trees surrounding them. No one slept well that night. The forest was too quiet, too still. And once, around 3 in the morning, Ranger Whitmore sat up in his sleeping bag and listened to something moving in the darkness beyond their firelight. Something that walked with heavy, deliberate steps, circling their camp but never coming close enough to see. When dawn finally came, they packed up quickly and continued north, following Marcus Davenport's impossible map toward whatever waited at the end of that trail that wasn't supposed to exist. The old camp Marcus had marked on his map wasn't hard to find once they knew where to look. After another 3 hours of following that phantom trail through increasingly dense forest, the search team emerged into a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to let filtered sunlight reach the ground. And there, half swallowed by moss and decades of vegetation, were the remains of a structure that had no business existing this deep in unmarked wilderness. It had been a cabin once, or maybe a logging foreman's shelter from the days when crews worked these mountains with crosscut saws and steam donkeys. The walls had collapsed inward years ago, leaving only the stone foundation and portions of the frame, gray weathered wood that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding deadfall. Rusted metal, tin roofing maybe, or the remains of a stove, poked through the undergrowth. Nature had been patient but thorough in its reclamation. Detective Voss stood at the edge of the clearing, studying what remained. "This place isn't on any map," she said quietly. "Not modern ones, not historical surveys. How did Marcus know it was here?" Ranger Whitmore was crouched near the foundation, examining the stonework. "This is old, 1920s, maybe even earlier, before the Forest Service really documented everything out here. There were probably dozens of camps like this scattered through these mountains, temporary shelters for logging operations or fire lookouts, and most of them were just abandoned and forgotten when the work moved elsewhere. But Marcus found it, one of the trackers said. He mapped a trail that led directly here, a trail no one else knew existed. They spread out through the clearing, searching for any sign that Marcus had been there, that he'd actually reached this place. The remains of the cabin offered little. The interior was choked with rotted wood and vegetation, everything too degraded to show recent disturbance. But near the eastern edge of the clearing, where the tree line began again, Detective Voss found something that made her pulse quicken. A piece of fabric, faded olive green, caught on a low branch about 4 feet off the ground. It was small, maybe 2 inches across, torn roughly as if it had been ripped away by movement through thick brush. The fabric was weathered but not completely degraded, and when Voss examined it closely, she could see the reflective tape still attached to one edge. Marcus's rain jacket had been olive green with reflective tape on the sleeves. She bagged it carefully, marking the exact location with GPS coordinates. It wasn't proof of anything definitive, but it was the first physical evidence they'd found that suggested Marcus had actually made it this far, nearly 14 miles from where his car had been abandoned 3 years earlier. But if he'd reached this clearing, what had happened next? Where had he gone from here? The answer to that question came from an unexpected direction. While the others searched the immediate area around the old camp, Ranger Whitmore had walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any indication of other trails leading away from the site. On the northern side, where the ground sloped down toward what sounded like running water, he found something that made him call the others over immediately. There were marks on a massive Douglas fir that stood at the edge of the clearing like a sentinel. Not the high gouges they'd seen earlier. These were different. Lower, roughly 5 to 6 feet off the ground, concentrated on the trunk facing away from the camp. They looked like claw marks, 4 parallel scores in the bark, but deeper and more deliberate than anything made by climbing or territorial marking. And there was something else, something far more disturbing. Caught in the rough bark, preserved by chance and the dry conditions under the tree's canopy, were several strands of what appeared to be hair. Not human hair. The texture was wrong, too coarse, and the color was a dark reddish-brown that didn't match any hair Marcus had in his photographs. The strands were long, maybe 5 or 6 inches, and when Whitmore carefully collected them, he noticed they had an odd smell, not unpleasant exactly, but musky and unfamiliar. Could be bear, he said, though his voice carried doubt. Or elk. Sometimes when they rub against trees, they leave hair behind. At 5 feet up? Detective Voss asked, with claw marks that deep. Whitmore didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the tree, at the marks, at the direction they faced, directly toward a break in the undergrowth that suggested something had moved through there with considerable force, snapping branches and flattening vegetation in a rough path that led downslope toward the sound of water. We need to follow that, Voss said. It's getting late, one of the trackers pointed out. The sun was already dropping below the ridgeline, and in the dense forest, twilight came early and dark came fast. We've been pushing hard all day. Maybe we should make camp here, start fresh in the morning. But Detective Voss was already moving toward the break in the trees, drawn by something she couldn't quite articulate, the sense that they were close to something, that after 3 years of nothing, the forest was finally giving up its secrets. Just a quick look, she said. 20 minutes. If we don't find anything, we'll come back and set up camp. The path down the slope was treacherous, slippery with moss and loose needles. The sound of water grew louder as they descended, resolving into the steady rush of a creek larger than the seasonal trickles they'd crossed earlier. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they found themselves standing on the rocky bank of a stream that ran cold and clear over water-smooth stones, maybe 15 feet across and deep enough in the center channel that crossing would mean getting wet up to mid-thigh. And there, on a flat rock near the water's edge, dried to a brittle gray-brown by exposure and time, was a single boot. Detective Voss recognized it immediately from the photographs Marcus's parents had provided. A Morel hiking boot, men's size 10, the same model and color Marcus had been wearing when he disappeared. The laces were still tied, pulled tight as if he'd made sure it was secure before setting out on his hike. But the boot was empty and there was no sign of the other one. She knelt beside it, her throat tight. After 3 years, this was the first substantial piece of Marcus Davenport they'd found. Not his body, not him. Just this abandoned boot sitting on a rock in the middle of nowhere. raising more questions than it could possibly answer. Why just one? One of the trackers asked quietly. If he fell in the water, if he had an accident, where's the other boot? Where's the rest of his gear? No one had an answer. They searched both banks of the creek as the light faded, looking for any other trace of Marcus or his equipment. They found nothing. No pack, no tent, no sleeping bag or GPS unit. Just that single boot, and the sound of water rushing endlessly over stone, and the weight of 3 years of unanswered questions pressing down on all of them. They made camp that night back up at the old cabin site, building their fire in the stone foundation where countless other fires had probably burned decades before. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, the way it does in the mountains, and they huddled close to the flames, eating trail food and speaking in low voices about what they'd found and what it might mean. He made it this far, Detective Voss said, staring into the fire. That fabric on the branch, the boot down by the creek, Marcus reached this place, but something happened here, something that made him lose his boot, maybe lose his pack. And then what? Where did he go? If he lost a boot, he couldn't have gone far, Ranger Whitmore said. Not in this terrain. The forest floor is too rough, too cold at night. Without proper footwear, especially in October, he would have been in serious trouble within hours. So where's his body? The question came from one of the trackers, a lean man named Chris Morrow, who'd been part of the original search operation 3 years earlier. If he was injured, if he couldn't walk, he would have stayed close to water. But we searched both banks for 100 yards in each direction. There's nothing there. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Beyond their small circle of light, the forest was completely black, a wall of shadow that felt almost solid in its density. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of the creek and the occasional settling of burning wood. What about those prints we found yesterday? Chris continued. The ones by the spring. Those weren't bear prints and they weren't human. So what were they? Could have been anything, Whitmore said, but he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Degraded prints can look strange, especially after weather and time. They were next to human prints, Chris pressed, walking parallel, in the same direction. That's not random. Detective Voss held up a hand. Let's not speculate beyond what we can prove. We know Marcus made it to this area. We know something happened that caused him to lose his boot. Everything else is just guessing until we have more evidence. But even as she said it, she was thinking about the claw marks on that tree, about the coarse reddish-brown hair, about the way the search dogs had refused to cross that creek 3 years ago. She was thinking about the trail that wasn't supposed to exist but did, and the map Marcus had drawn of a path he shouldn't have known was there. She was thinking about things that didn't add up, that didn't fit into any rational explanation she could construct. Around midnight, Chris Morrow woke the others. He'd been on watch, feeding the fire, when he heard something moving in the forest beyond their camp. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness upslope, moving parallel to their position. Footsteps, he said. Heavy and deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested something large walking on 2 legs. They sat in silence, listening. For several minutes there was nothing but the fire and their own breathing. Then they all heard it. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of something moving through the undergrowth, branches snapping under significant weight. It circled their camp slowly, staying just beyond the reach of the firelight, never approaching but never leaving either. Ranger Whitmore grabbed a high-powered flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam lanced out into the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and hanging moss and thick undergrowth, but nothing moved in the light. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was out there understood what the light meant and chose to freeze rather than reveal itself. They kept the fire burning high for the rest of the night, feeding it every log they could find, pushing back the darkness as far as possible. No one slept. They sat with their backs to the fire, watching the forest, listening to the silence that felt less empty than waiting, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the canopy with agonizing gradualness. When there was finally enough light to see clearly, they searched the area where the sounds had come from. The ground was too covered in needles and deadfall to show clear prints, but they found places where the undergrowth had been disturbed, branches pushed aside or broken, vegetation flattened by the passage of something large, and they found one clear print, preserved in a small patch of exposed soil near a rotting log. It was enormous, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what looked like the heel of a foot pressing deep into the earth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed several hundred pounds at minimum. Detective Voss photographed it from every angle, placed a ruler beside it for scale, took soil samples from the depression. She did everything by the book, documented everything properly, but her hands were shaking slightly as she worked. "What made that?" Chris asked quietly. No one answered because no one had an answer that made sense. They broke camp quickly, eager to be moving, to be doing something other than standing in that clearing surrounded by too many questions and not enough explanations. Detective Voss made the call to continue following Marcus's trail, to see where it led beyond the old camp, even though the map he'd drawn ended at this location. If he'd come this far, maybe he'd left some indication of where he intended to go next. They found that indication less than an hour later, in a place that fundamentally changed how everyone involved understood what had happened to Marcus Davenport. Following the creek downstream from where they'd found the boot, moving carefully over slippery rocks and through thick riparian vegetation, they rounded a bend and discovered something that stopped them all dead in their tracks. There was a cave entrance in the ravine wall, maybe 20 feet above the current water level, accessible by a steep slope of loose rock and dirt. The opening was roughly oval, about 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, dark as a throat leading into the hillside. It wasn't visible from most angles, hidden by an overhang and the way the ravine curved, but once you knew it was there, it was obvious. And carved into the soft stone beside the entrance, crude but unmistakable, were letters. M.D. 10/16/21. Marcus Davenport had been here. 2 days after he was last seen, he'd found this cave and marked his presence. He'd survived that long, at least. But why hadn't he turned back? Why hadn't he tried to return to his car, to get help? Why go deeper into the wilderness instead of out? Detective Voss climbed the slope carefully, the others following close behind. At the cave entrance, she paused, playing her flashlight into the darkness beyond. The beam revealed a passage that extended back into the hillside, narrow but navigable. The walls natural stone worn smooth by centuries of water seepage and geological patience. "Marcus!" she called into the cave, knowing it was pointless after 3 years but unable to stop herself. "Marcus Davenport!" Her voice echoed back, distorted by the stone, fading into silence. No response, just darkness and cold air that smelled of minerals and earth and something else, something organic and old that she couldn't quite identify. They entered the cave together, moving slowly, flashlights sweeping the passage ahead. The floor was uneven, scattered with fallen rock and patches of mud brought in by ancient floods. The passage curved gently to the left, descending slightly, and after maybe 30 feet, opened into a larger chamber roughly the size of a 2-car garage. Marcus Davenport's camp was there, preserved by the dry air and constant temperature of the cave. His pack leaned against one wall, the tent partially set up but collapsed. His sleeping bag was spread out on the cave floor. Empty food wrappers and water bottles were scattered around what had clearly been a temporary living space. His GPS unit sat on a rock, the screen dark and dead after 3 years without power. But Marcus himself was gone. Detective Voss approached the camp slowly, documenting everything with her camera, trying to understand what she was seeing. This wasn't the camp of someone lost or injured. This was deliberate, organized. Marcus had chosen to come here, had set up camp, had stayed for some period of time. But why? On the cave wall above where his pack rested, Marcus had written more messages, this time in pencil on the pale stone. The writing was cramped and rushed, less neat than his map notations, but still legible. "Can't go back the way I came. It followed me from the old camp, watched me all night. Tried to cross the creek, but it was there on the other side. Too big. Found this cave Oct 16. Waiting until it leaves, running low on food. And below that, in shakier handwriting, it knows I'm here. I can hear it outside at night. Not bear, not elk, don't know what. Can't stay. We'll try to go north when it's light. If anyone finds this, tell Mom and Dad I tried to make it home." The last entry was dated October 19th, 2021, 5 days after he'd started his hike, 6 days before the official search had been called off due to weather. Detective Voss stood in that cave, reading Marcus's final messages, and felt something crack in her professional detachment. This wasn't just another missing person case anymore. This was a graduate student who'd followed an old trail into the wilderness and found something that terrified him so badly he'd hidden in a cave for 3 days, too afraid to try to make it back to civilization until desperation and dwindling supplies forced him to take his chances. What was he running from? Chris asked quietly. Was it just fear? Just the forest playing tricks on someone who'd gotten turned around and panicked? Or was Marcus Davenport, careful and methodical and experienced, genuinely pursued by something in those woods that none of them wanted to acknowledge might be real? They collected everything from the cave, his pack, his equipment, his written messages. They documented the site thoroughly, knowing this was now the focal point of a reinvigorated investigation. And as they worked, each of them was acutely aware that Marcus had written about heading north when he finally left the cave, trying to escape whatever he believed was hunting him. North, deeper into the wilderness, away from roads and trails and any hope of rescue. Outside, the daylight seemed brighter after the cave's darkness, but no less unsettling. Detective Voss gathered the team, made the decision that she knew would be controversial but was necessary. They would continue north, following the route Marcus had likely taken when he fled the cave 3 years ago. They would search for as long as supplies allowed, hoping against hope that they might find some final trace of him, some answer to what had happened after October 19, 2021. They followed the ravine north for another 2 miles, the terrain growing increasingly difficult, the forest pressing in from all sides. The creek narrowed and deepened, rushing through channels carved over millennia, too dangerous to cross safely. They were forced to climb out of the ravine and continue along the ridge above, losing sight of the water but maintaining their northward trajectory. That's when they found the second set of claw marks, these even more disturbing than the first. A hemlock tree, maybe 200 years old, bore deep gouges that spiraled around the trunk from about 12 feet up all the way down to ground level, as if something had gripped the tree and slid down with enormous force, tearing through bark and into the wood beneath. The marks were weathered but still clearly visible, and at the base of the tree, driven into the wood like decorations, were bones. Small bones, vertebrae, and ribs, too degraded to identify the species with certainty, but probably deer or elk, arranged in a rough pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Around the base of the tree, the ground was disturbed, scraped clean of needles in a rough circle maybe 10 feet across, exposing the dark soil underneath. "What is this?" one of the trackers whispered. "Some kind of territorial marker?" "Animals don't do this," Ranger Whitmore said slowly. I don't know what this is." Detective Voss photographed everything, collected samples, marked the location. But her mind was racing, trying to find rational explanations, and coming up empty. Bears marked territory, yes, but not like this. Mountain lions cached kills, but not this way. No known animal in these forests would arrange bones in patterns or create cleared spaces around specific trees, and yet something had. They were nearly 2 miles beyond the cave, discussing whether to push further or start the long hike back to civilization, when Chris Morrow, who'd been scouting slightly ahead, called out in a voice tight with shock, "You need to see this, right now." They found him standing at the edge of a small clearing, staring at something on the ground. When Detective Voss reached his side and looked down, she felt her stomach drop. There were boot prints in the soft earth, weathered but still visible. Human boot prints, the tread pattern distinct. They led into the clearing from the south, staggered and uneven, suggesting someone stumbling or injured. The prints were accompanied by drag marks, as if whoever made them had been using a stick or branch for support. Marcus had made it this far, at least 2 miles beyond the cave, pushing north through increasingly hostile terrain, injured or exhausted or both. But he hadn't made it out of this clearing. The boot prints stopped in the center of the open space, churned and confused, as if Marcus had stood there for some time, turning in circles, maybe trying to decide which way to go. And then the prints simply ended, right there in the middle of disturbed earth. What didn't end were the other tracks. The large, impossible prints they'd seen before were all around Marcus's boot prints, circling them, overlapping in places, so many of them that the ground was torn and muddled. And there were signs of struggle, Deep gouges in the earth, displaced rocks, broken branches at the clearing's edge. And then nothing. No boot prints leading away. No sign of Marcus's body or equipment. No blood, no torn fabric, no indication of what final fate had befallen him in this anonymous clearing miles from anywhere. It was as if he'd been standing there surrounded by something and then ceased to exist. Detective Sarah Voss has been in law enforcement for 23 years. She's worked homicides, missing persons, cold cases that stretched back decades. She's seen bodies pulled from rivers and ravines, found hikers who died from exposure within sight of roads they never knew were there, investigated deaths that seemed impossible until evidence revealed the mundane truth beneath. She's learned to trust facts, to follow evidence, to build cases on what can be proven rather than what feels true. But standing in that clearing, looking at boot prints that simply ended and tracks that suggested something impossible, she felt the foundation of that rational worldview begin to crack. "We need to expand the search radius," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional. "Marcus could have been dragged or carried from this location. We search in widening circles, document everything we find, maintain proper evidence protocols." They spent the next 4 hours combing through every inch of terrain within a quarter-mile radius of that clearing. They found nothing. No drag marks leading away. No disturbed vegetation suggesting a body had been moved through the undergrowth. No blood, no fabric, no equipment. The forest had swallowed Marcus Davenport as completely as if he'd never existed, and left behind only questions that grew more disturbing the longer they went unanswered. As the afternoon wore on and their search yielded nothing but more confusion, Ranger Whitmore made a discovery that added another layer of strangeness to an already inexplicable situation. About 300 yards east of the clearing, he found a game trail. A real one this time, worn by years of deer and elk movement. And beside it, hanging from a low branch about 7 feet up, was Marcus's other boot. Not on the ground where it might have been dropped, not discarded beside the trail. Hanging from a branch, the laces tied around the wood in a deliberate knot, as if someone had carefully placed it there as a marker or a message. The implications were unsettling enough that no one spoke for several seconds after Whitmore called the others over to see. If Marcus had lost his boot in the clearing, and they had no evidence that was his other boot, though it seemed likely, how had it ended up here, suspended in a tree, tied with knots that required manual dexterity and intentional action? Had Marcus himself put it there somehow? But why would he walk 300 yards through rough terrain with only one boot, climb or reach up 7 feet, and carefully hang his footwear from a branch? It made no sense. The alternative, that something else had moved the boot, had placed it there deliberately, made even less sense, but the evidence was impossible to interpret any other way. Detective Voss cut the boot down carefully, preserving the knot, bagging everything as evidence. Her mind was working through scenarios, trying to find explanations that didn't require abandoning everything she understood about how the world worked. Maybe Marcus hadn't lost the boot in the clearing. Maybe he'd taken it off here, tied it to mark his location for some reason, then continued barefoot or with improvised wrapping on his feet. Maybe the clearing was later, or earlier, and they were misreading the timeline, but she didn't believe any of those maybes. The evidence told a different story, one she wasn't ready to accept but couldn't completely dismiss. They made camp that night in a defensive position, backs to a rock face that prevented anything from approaching from behind. Fire built large and fed constantly. They took turns on watch in pairs, no one sleeping deeply, everyone listening to the forest sounds that seemed both too loud and not loud enough. Around 2 a.m, during Chris Morrow's watch shift, they heard it again. Movement in the forest, heavy and deliberate, circling their position but maintaining distance. This time, Chris used a thermal imaging scope, part of their search equipment for finding heat signatures in dense terrain. He swept the device slowly across the forest, looking for the telltale glow of body heat. He found something. Roughly 60 yards out, moving through the trees at about 8 feet off the ground, was a heat signature unlike anything he'd seen before. Too large and too hot for a bear, shaped wrong for elk, positioned too high to be any ground-dwelling animal. The signature was humanoid in its general shape, 2 legs, torso, arms, but enormous, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, moving with a gait that suggested bipedal locomotion. Chris watched it through the scope for nearly 3 minutes as it circled their camp, never approaching closer than 50 yards, never moving into a position where firelight or flashlights might reveal it clearly. Then, as if it had accomplished whatever purpose brought it there, the heat signature moved away to the north, disappearing into the vast darkness of the forest. In the morning, they found tracks where Chris had seen the thermal signature. The same massive prints they'd encountered before, pressed deep into soft earth, showing clear toe impressions, and what looked like the ball and heel of an enormous foot. They photographed everything, measured everything, collected soil samples and made plaster casts, even though they knew the evidence would raise more questions than it answered. "We need to get this to experts," Detective Voss said quietly. "Wildlife biologists, forensic anthropologists, people who can analyze what we're finding and give us concrete answers about what made these tracks." But even as she said it, she was thinking about that thermal signature moving through the trees 8 feet off the ground, about boot prints that ended in empty air, about Marcus Davenport's final messages scratched on cave walls. She was thinking about questions that maybe didn't have concrete answers, not the kind that fit into incident reports and court testimony. The hike back to civilization took 2 full days, moving faster now without the need to search every foot of terrain. They carried with them Marcus's belongings from the cave, the boots they'd found, hundreds of photographs, soil samples, hair samples, plaster casts of prints that shouldn't exist. They carried evidence of something, but none of them could agree on what that something was. By the time they reached the trailhead where Marcus's Subaru had been found 3 years earlier, Detective Voss had made several decisions. First, they would treat this as an active homicide investigation, even without a body, because the evidence suggested Marcus had met with foul play of some kind. Second, they would consult with every expert they could find, wildlife biologists, anthropologists, search and rescue specialists with decades of wilderness experience, to analyze what they'd found. And third, though she didn't say this part out loud, she would pursue the truth wherever it led, even if it led to conclusions that couldn't be easily explained or accepted. The forensic analysis of the evidence took weeks. The fabric found at the old camp matched Marcus's rain jacket, same manufacturer, same materials, same reflective tape composition. DNA extracted from skin cells on the fabric confirmed it had been worn by Marcus Davenport. The boots were definitively his, matching purchase records and wear patterns from photographs his parents had provided. The handwriting on the cave walls and the maps was verified by forensic document examiners as Marcus's own, written under stress but without any indication of coercion or psychological break. The hair samples found at the old camp were more problematic. Initial analysis suggested they were mammalian, keratin-based, consistent with primate hair structure, but not matching any known primate species in North America. The texture and pigmentation didn't correspond to bear, elk, deer, mountain goat, or any other large mammal native to Washington. Further testing using mitochondrial DNA analysis produced results that one lab technician described as anomalous, showing genetic markers that suggested primate ancestry, but didn't match any species in existing databases. When Detective Voss pressed for clarification, the technician was careful with his words. "It's possible the samples were contaminated," he said, "or degraded by environmental exposure. Or there's some error in our analysis. Because the alternative, that these samples came from an unknown primate species in the Pacific Northwest, would be unprecedented." "What about the footprint casts?" Voss asked. The forensic anthropologist who examined the plaster casts was equally uncomfortable with her conclusions. Dr. Jiwi Lisa Chen, a professor at Portland State University who'd spent 30 years studying human and primate locomotion, laid out the casts on her laboratory table and spoke with the careful precision of someone who didn't want to be misquoted. "These prints show characteristics consistent with bipedal locomotion," she explained, gesturing to the toe impressions and heel structure. "The weight distribution, the arch formation, the toe alignment, all of this suggests something that walks primarily on 2 legs, which among large mammals is extremely rare outside of humans." "Could they be bear prints?" Detective Voss asked, hoping for a simple explanation. "No. Bear prints are distinctive. The toe arrangement is different. The heel pad has a specific shape, and bears that rear up on hind legs don't leave prints this deep or this consistently bipedal." These prints suggest something that walks upright habitually, not occasionally. Human, then? Someone wearing unusual footwear, or... Dr. Chen shook her head slowly. The size is wrong. A human foot this large would belong to someone well over 9 feet tall and weighing perhaps 600 to 800 pounds. There's no record of any human, even accounting for gigantism or other growth disorders, who would leave prints like these. The proportions are also off. The foot is too wide relative to its length compared to human norms. So what made them? The anthropologist chose her words very carefully. I don't know. The prints show characteristics of primate locomotion, but from a creature far larger than any known primate in North America. Either your casts are from something misidentified or misunderstood, or... She trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Or what? Detective Voss pressed. Dr. Chen met her eyes. Or there's a large bipedal primate living in the forests of Washington that hasn't been officially documented by science, which would be extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But evidence was exactly what they had. Not just tracks and hair samples, but a documented trail that didn't appear on any official map. A graduate student with no history of mental illness who'd described being pursued by something he couldn't identify, and physical signs of something large moving through terrain where nothing that size was supposed to exist. Detective Voss spent hours interviewing people who lived and worked in and around the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, looking for similar reports, trying to establish whether Marcus's experience was unique or part of a larger pattern. What she found disturbed her more than any single piece of evidence had. Ray Tucker, a hunting guide who'd worked the area for 42 years, told her about clients who'd come back from the backcountry swearing they'd seen something watching them from the tree line, something too large to be bare, that moved on 2 legs. He told her about finding tree breaks 12 feet up, massive branches snapped cleanly as if something enormously strong had pulled them down. He told her about areas where game animals simply didn't go, places that should have been prime habitat but were avoided as if by instinct. We don't talk about it much, Ray said quietly. People think you're crazy if you do. But anyone who spends real time in these mountains, away from the trails and the tourists, has stories. Things they've seen or heard that don't fit into neat categories. Most folks just keep it to themselves. A Forest Service employee named Janet Kowalski, who'd worked at the Randall Ranger Station for 18 years, told Detective Voss about incident reports that came in every year. Hikers who'd heard screams in the night that sounded almost human, but wrong somehow. Campers who'd found their food cache torn open by something with strength far beyond any bear. Experienced hunters who'd cut their trips short because they felt watched, followed, unsafe in ways they couldn't articulate. We log the reports, but there's not much we can do with them, Janet explained. What are we supposed to say? That the forest has something in it we can't identify? We'd sound ridiculous. So we tell people to store food properly, make noise while hiking, carry bear spray. Standard advice, but between you and me, I don't go into the backcountry alone anymore. Haven't for 10 years. Not since I heard something pacing my campsite all night, something that walked on 2 legs and breathed so heavily I could hear it from inside my tent. The pattern was clear. Marcus Davenport hadn't been the first person to encounter something unexplained in those forests. He'd simply been unlucky enough to encounter it far from help, and thorough enough to document his experience in ways that left evidence behind. But patterns and anecdotes weren't enough for the Skamania County Prosecutor's Office to bring charges against anyone or anything. Without a body, without a clear cause of death, without a suspect who could be named and held accountable, Marcus Davenport's case remained officially classified as a missing person investigation with suspected foul play, status unresolved. For his parents, Richard and Linda Davenport, the discovery of Marcus's final camp and his last messages provided a measure of terrible closure. They knew now that their son had survived for at least 5 days after he'd gone missing, that he'd been resourceful and determined, that he'd tried his best to make it home. They knew he'd been afraid of something real, not imagining threats in a panicked state, but rationally assessing danger and taking steps to survive. I always wondered if he'd made some careless mistake, Linda Davenport told me when I interviewed her 6 months after the case was reopened. If he'd been reckless or unprepared. But Marcus wasn't reckless. He never was. And now we know he did everything right. He found shelter. He tried to wait out whatever was out there. He made the choice to move when he had to. Whatever happened, it wasn't because he made mistakes. Does it help knowing that? I asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window of her Bellingham home at the gray October sky. Yes and no, she finally said. It helps to know he fought to survive. It helps to have his things back, to have something tangible that was with him at the end. But it also means we have to accept that there are things in those forests we don't understand, things that maybe took our son from us, and I don't know how to live with that. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was deceptively simple. What happened in that clearing where Marcus's tracks ended? The rational explanations all had problems. If he'd been attacked by an animal, there should have been blood, torn clothing, signs of predation. If he'd fallen and injured himself, his body should have been nearby. If he'd somehow continued on despite his injuries, there should have been tracks leading away. But there was nothing. Just boot prints that stopped and the evidence of something large circling him in those final moments. The less rational explanations, that something unknown had taken him, carried him off, removed him from that clearing by methods that left no trace, required accepting the existence of something that mainstream science insisted didn't exist. A large, intelligent, bipedal creature living in the forests of North America, avoiding human contact but occasionally intersecting with people in ways that ended badly. It was a conclusion that made people uncomfortable. It raised questions about what else might be hidden in the vast wilderness areas that still covered much of the continent. It suggested that despite satellites and GPS and the constant monitoring of the modern world, there were still blank spaces on the map, still unknown things in the shadows. In November of 2024, 7 months after Marcus's map case was found and his final camp discovered, a group of hunters working the backcountry north of where Marcus disappeared reported finding a cave about 5 miles beyond the clearing where his tracks had ended. Inside the cave, partially buried under rockfall and debris, they found human remains. Detective Voss was called to the scene immediately. The recovery operation took 2 days, carefully excavating the remains and the surrounding material, documenting everything before removing it for forensic analysis. The bones were incomplete, scattered by animals and time, but enough remained for identification. DNA comparison confirmed what everyone had already suspected. The remains were Marcus Davenport's. He'd made it 5 more miles beyond the clearing somehow, despite being injured and minus at least 1 boot. He'd found another cave, sought shelter again, and this time he hadn't emerged. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains noted multiple healed fractures in the legs and ribs, injuries consistent with falls or impacts, suggesting Marcus had been severely injured during his final days. The cause of death was listed as exposure and probable dehydration, compounded by untreated traumatic injuries. He'd died alone in the darkness, 5 miles from the nearest trail, more than 20 miles from where his car had been parked. But he hadn't died immediately. Based on the evidence found in and around his final shelter, Marcus had survived in that cave for possibly several days after reaching it. He'd arranged rocks into a rough windbreak near the entrance. He'd collected water in his empty bottles from seepage on the cave walls. He'd done everything possible to stay alive. And he'd left one final message, scratched into the cave wall with a sharp stone, the letters rough and barely legible, but unmistakable in their meaning. It brought me here. Don't know why. It could have killed me, but didn't. Watched me from the entrance for hours, then left. Legs broken. Can't walk. No one will find me this far. Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell them I saw something impossible. Tell them it was real. The date beside the message was October 23, 2021, 9 days after Marcus had started his hike, 6 days after he'd written his last message in the first cave. Somewhere in those 6 days, despite broken legs and failing strength, Marcus had traveled 5 miles through wilderness terrain that would challenge a healthy, fully equipped hiker. He'd traveled it because, according to his own words, something had brought him there. The final cave was located in a narrow ravine, accessible only by a steep descent that would have been nearly impossible for someone with broken legs to navigate on their own. The entrance was partially concealed by overhanging rock, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't a place someone stumbling through the forest in pain and confusion would randomly discover. It was a place someone, or something, would need to bring you to. Detective Voss stood outside that cave on a cold November afternoon, trying to reconcile the evidence with any explanation that made sense. If Marcus's legs were broken in the clearing where his tracks ended, how had he moved 5 miles north? If he couldn't walk, who or what had transported him? And why would something capable of breaking a man's legs then carry him to shelter rather than simply killing him? The questions multiplied, fractured, led to more questions instead of answers. But standing there in that ravine, listening to the silence of the forest, Detective Voss found herself thinking about the thermal signature Chris Morrow had seen moving through the trees 8 feet off the ground. She thought about tracks that suggested bipedal locomotion from something massive and unknown. She thought about Marcus's map of a trail that didn't officially exist but was definitely there. She thought about the possibility that the forests of the Pacific Northwest held secrets that couldn't be explained, phenomena that didn't fit into the neat categories of wildlife biology and forensic science. And she thought about the fact that Marcus Davenport, careful and methodical and experienced, had spent his final days believing he'd encountered something impossible, something real. Could coincidence and misidentification explain everything? Could rational analysis account for every strange detail of Marcus's disappearance and death? Or was there something in those mountains that existed in the spaces between known and unknown, documented and mythical? The official cause of death for Marcus Davenport was exposure complicated by multiple traumatic injuries, including bilateral leg fractures, several broken ribs, and severe dehydration. The manner of death was listed as accidental, the result of a hiking incident in remote wilderness terrain. The case was closed on December 12, 2024, 3 years and 2 months after Marcus had driven his blue Subaru Outback to that forgotten trailhead and walked into a forest that would never let him walk out. On paper, it was a tragic but straightforward conclusion. A young man had ventured too far into dangerous country, suffered injuries that prevented his return, and died alone despite his best efforts to survive. It happened sometimes in the vast wilderness areas of the American West. The forest gave nothing back easily, and sometimes it gave nothing back at all. But Detective Sarah Voss couldn't shake the feeling that the official narrative missed something fundamental about what had really happened to Marcus Davenport. She'd compiled a file nearly 4 inches thick with evidence that didn't fit the simple story of a hiking accident. The trail that appeared on Marcus's map but on no official survey. The hair samples that didn't match any known North American mammal. The footprint casts that suggested bipedal locomotion from something far larger than any documented primate. The thermal signature moving through trees at impossible heights. Marcus's own testimony, written in those final desperate messages, describing something that watched him, followed him, and ultimately, if his words could be trusted, carried him to that final cave despite injuries that should have left him immobile. 3 weeks after Marcus's remains were formally identified and released to his family, Detective Voss did something she'd never done in 23 years of law enforcement. She reached out to researchers who studied phenomena outside the boundaries of mainstream science. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum was a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, and one of the few credentialed scientists willing to publicly discuss the possibility of undocumented primates in North America. When Detective Voss contacted him and explained what she'd found in the Gifford Pinchot, he drove to Washington within 3 days. They met at a coffee shop in Stevenson, spread out photographs and reports on a corner table, spoke in low voices about evidence that most people would dismiss as impossible. Dr. Meldrum examined the footprint casts, studied the photographs of tree damage and ground disturbances, read Marcus's final messages with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating claims that straddled the line between science and speculation. "The prints are consistent with others I've examined," he said finally, choosing his words with academic precision. "The biomechanics are sound. These could come from a large bipedal primate. The depth of impression suggests significant weight distributed across a foot structure adapted for upright locomotion. The toe spread and arch formation indicate functionality, not hoaxing." "So you think they're real?" Voss asked. "That something made these prints? Something unknown?" "I think the evidence warrants serious investigation," Dr. Meldrum said carefully. "There are thousands of reported sightings of large bipedal creatures in the forests of North America going back centuries. Indigenous peoples have traditions about these beings that predate European contact, and there's a consistent pattern to the physical evidence: footprints, hair samples, vocalizations recorded in remote areas. None of it constitutes proof of existence by scientific standards, but the volume and consistency of evidence suggests something is generating these reports. But why hasn't one been found? Detective Voss asked the question that everyone asked, the obvious challenge to any claim of unknown creatures in modern America. With millions of hikers, hunters, thousands of trail cameras, satellite imagery, how could something that large remain hidden? Dr. Meldrum smiled slightly. The same way wolverines remained scientifically unverified in California until 2008, despite being there all along. The same way new species of large mammals are still being discovered in remote areas globally. The Pacific Northwest contains millions of acres of forest, much of it so dense and inaccessible that it's rarely visited by humans. If you're talking about a creature that's intelligent, wary of humans, possibly with a small population, remaining undetected isn't as impossible as it seems. He paused, looking at the photographs of the clearing where Marcus's tracks had ended. But what happened to your missing person? If something did carry him after his injuries, that suggests a level of behavior we don't see in known apes. Gorillas don't carry injured humans to shelter. Chimpanzees don't protect humans from predation. If Marcus's account is accurate, something made a choice to not kill him when it easily could have. That implies cognition, maybe even empathy, at a level that would be extraordinary. They talked for 3 hours, working through scenarios and possibilities, trying to construct explanations that accounted for all the evidence without requiring too great a leap beyond known science. But every explanation had gaps, required assumptions that couldn't be proven, left questions that felt too large to answer. Finally, Dr. Meldrum said something that stayed with Detective Voss long after their meeting ended. "You're asking the wrong question," he said gently. "You're asking if these creatures exist, if what happened to Marcus was real or explainable by conventional means. But maybe the better question is, why does it matter? Marcus Davenport is gone either way. His family has their son back. They can give him a proper burial. They have closure after 3 years of not knowing. Whether he died after a simple hiking accident or after an encounter with something unknown. Does the answer change anything important? But it did matter. At least to Detective Voss, it mattered. Because if Marcus had been telling the truth in those final messages, if something had pursued him and ultimately moved him to that final cave, then it meant the world was stranger and more dangerous than the official map suggested. It meant there were still wild things in the wild places, still phenomena beyond human understanding, still mysteries that couldn't be solved by forensic science and GPS coordinates. Marcus Davenport's funeral was held on a gray December morning in Bellingham, rain falling softly from clouds that pressed low over the city. More than 200 people attended, friends from university, fellow hikers who'd known him from trail forums and mapping projects, faculty members who'd supervised his graduate work, and dozens of people who'd never met Marcus but had followed his case, had participated in searches, had held on to hope for 3 years that he might somehow be found alive. Detective Voss attended, standing in the back of the church, listening to eulogy after eulogy that painted a portrait of a careful, thoughtful young man who loved wild places and dedicated his life to documenting and understanding them. Marcus's father spoke, his voice breaking several times, about a son who always came home, who always checked in, who never took unnecessary risks. Marcus's mother read from a journal her son had kept, entries about trails he'd explored and places he wanted to map, words that revealed his passion for the work that had ultimately killed him. And Stephen Chen, Marcus's roommate, spoke about the last conversation they'd had, that morning 3 years ago when Marcus had loaded his Subaru and headed south toward the Gifford Pinchot. Stephen had asked him if he was excited about the mapping project, and Marcus had said something that, in retrospect, carried an odd weight. "He told me he felt like he was on the edge of discovering something important," Stephen said quietly. "Something about those old trails? About paths that had been forgotten or deliberately hidden. He said he thought there were places in those mountains that didn't want to be found, and that made him want to find them even more." After the service, as people gathered in small groups sharing memories and coffee, Detective Voss approached Marcus's parents. She'd spoken with them multiple times throughout the investigation, but this felt different. Not a detective delivering updates, but one human being offering condolences to others who'd suffered an impossible loss. "I'm so sorry," she said simply, because what else was there to say? Linda Davenport took her hands, held them tightly. "Thank you for not giving up, for finding him, for bringing our son home. I wish I could have brought him home alive." "We all do," Richard Davenport said quietly, "but at least we know now. At least we're not still wondering, still hoping, still checking our phones every time they ring. The not knowing was killing us slowly. It's terrible, but it's a kind of peace." Detective Voss hesitated, then decided they deserved honesty. "There are things about Marcus's case that I don't fully understand. Evidence that doesn't fit conventional explanations. I want you to know that." Linda nodded slowly. "We read his messages, the ones from the caves. He said he saw something impossible. Marcus wasn't the type to imagine things or exaggerate. If he said it was real, then it was real." "What do you think he saw?" Detective Voss asked. Linda looked at her husband, some unspoken communication passing between them, before turning back. "I think he saw something the forest wanted to keep hidden, and I think it let him live longer than it could have, for reasons we'll never understand. That's not closure exactly, but it's something. It means his last days weren't just terror and pain. Something in those mountains made a choice about my son. Maybe we should be grateful it didn't make a different choice." Detective Voss thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. The idea that Marcus's death, tragic as it was, might represent a kind of mercy from something that could have simply killed him in that first clearing. The notion that his broken legs and that impossible 5-mile journey to a hidden cave might have been an attempt, however brutal, to give him shelter, to protect him from something worse. But mercy from what? And protection from what? The questions circled endlessly, chasing their own tails. In January of 2025, Detective Voss made one final trip to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. She went alone, against every safety protocol, hiking back to the area where Marcus had disappeared 3 years earlier. She followed his map, that impossible trail marked in red ink, retracing his final journey as closely as she could reconstruct it. The winter forest was silent and still, the trails buried under 3 feet of snow, the trees stark against gray skies. She made it to the old camp where they'd found fabric from Marcus's jacket, then down to the creek where his first boot had been discovered, then up to the cave where he'd written those first desperate messages. She stood at the cave entrance, looking out at the ravine below, trying to imagine what Marcus had felt sheltering here, listening to something circling outside in the darkness, knowing he was trapped and running low on food and time. She thought about the choice he'd made to leave this relative safety and push north, deeper into wilderness, either running from something or running toward a hope of rescue that would never come. And as she stood there, as afternoon faded toward evening and the temperature dropped toward 0, she heard something. It started as a sound so low she felt it more than heard it, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the forest itself, resonating through the ground and up into her chest. Then it resolved into something more distinct, a vocalization, long and rising, that was almost like a scream, but too deep, too resonant to be human. It echoed through the ravine, bouncing off stone walls, making it impossible to determine direction or distance. Every rational part of Detective Voss's brain told her it was wind through the trees, or a cougar's cry distorted by terrain, or some acoustic quirk of the ravine creating sounds from nothing. But standing there alone in the failing light, she understood viscerally what Marcus must have felt. The bone-deep knowledge that something was out there, something large and aware, something watching from the spaces between trees where shadows grew too deep to penetrate. She didn't wait for dark. She turned and hiked out fast, not quite running but moving with purpose, her hand near the can of bear spray on her belt, her awareness heightened to every sound and movement around her. She made it back to the trailhead as full darkness fell, started her truck with shaking hands, and drove back to civilization feeling like she'd narrowly escaped something she couldn't name. She never went back. The official investigation into Marcus Davenport's death ended with his funeral and the closure of his case file. But the unofficial investigation, the one conducted in online forums and camping conversations, in graduate theses and documentary proposals, continued. Marcus's story spread through the hiking community, through forums dedicated to missing persons in wilderness areas, through the shadowy corners of the internet where people discussed encounters with things that weren't supposed to exist. Some people saw Marcus's experience as proof of their beliefs about undocumented creatures in North American forests. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo hiking in remote areas. Still others saw it as a mystery that would never be fully solved, evidence that despite humanity's technological advancement and scientific knowledge, there were still blank spaces on the map, still unknowns in the darkness. In the spring of 2025, Marcus's parents established a scholarship fund in his name for graduate students studying cartography and wilderness conservation. They donated his maps and field notes to the University of Washington Library, where researchers could access them, study his methodology, maybe even follow up on his work documenting forgotten trails and abandoned places. Among those donated materials was the waterproof map case that fishermen had found in that creek bed, the case that had started the final chapter of Marcus's story. And inside the case, along with the map showing the trail that didn't officially exist, was something the investigators had cataloged but not fully examined at the time. A small field journal, water-damaged but largely intact, containing Marcus's daily notes from his final hike. A graduate student named Emma Rodriguez discovered the journal while researching Marcus's mapping techniques for her own thesis work. Most of the entries were technical: elevation measurements, coordinates, notes about trail conditions and vegetation patterns. But the final entry, dated October 16, 2021, the same day Marcus had found the first cave, contained something that made Emma bring it immediately to Detective Voss's attention. The entry read, "Found the trail exactly where the forestry records indicated, though it's not on modern maps. Followed it for approximately 14 miles to an abandoned logging camp. The trail is real, definitely human-made, probably 1920s or 30s based on the clearing methods and structure remains. But here's what I don't understand. The trail is still maintained. Not officially, not by Forest Service, but something is keeping it clear. Fresh breaks on branches that would block passage, rocks moved from the path, fallen logs shifted to the side. The work is recent, within the past month based on vegetation regrowth. I thought maybe it was hikers or hunters using an old route, but I haven't seen any boot prints other than mine. No trash, no campfire remains, nothing to suggest regular human traffic. So what's keeping this trail open? Who, or what, is maintaining a path that officially doesn't exist, in terrain no one is supposed to be using?" Detective Voss read that entry 3 times, thinking about its implications. The trail Marcus had mapped wasn't just an abandoned remnant of logging operations. It was actively maintained by something that moved through those forests, something that needed or wanted that route kept clear and passable. The question of why haunted her. What purpose would such a trail serve? Where did it ultimately lead? And had Marcus stumbled onto something that was never meant to be discovered by outsiders? Had he become an unwitting trespasser in territory that something else considered its own? She thought about indigenous legends from the Pacific Northwest, stories that predated European settlement by thousands of years. The Lummi people spoke of Tsemiques, wild men of the woods who walked like humans but were not human. The Salish told stories of Saskats, giants who lived in the high mountains and avoided contact with ordinary people. The Yakima had traditions about beings who were protectors of the forest, who would guide lost children to safety but could also drive away those who disrespected the land. Were these legends just stories, cultural narratives to explain natural phenomena and teach respect for wilderness? Or were they something more? Oral histories describing real encounters with something that had learned long ago to stay hidden, to avoid direct contact with humans, to exist in the spaces between known and unknown. There was no way to prove it either way. And that, Detective Voss realized, was exactly the point. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some questions couldn't be answered with evidence and analysis. Sometimes the truth existed in that uncomfortable space between belief and skepticism, where rational explanation broke down and something older, stranger, took over. Marcus Davenport had gone into those mountains looking for forgotten trails and found something far more profound. evidence of a presence that maintained pathways through wilderness, that moved with intelligence and purpose through terrain most humans would find impassable, that was capable of both threat and mercy in ways that defied understanding. And in finding that evidence, in documenting that trail and pushing deeper into territory that something else claimed, Marcus had paid the ultimate price, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd crossed a boundary that he didn't know existed, ventured into spaces where human maps didn't apply, and human assumptions about the natural world no longer held true. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Marcus's final remains, Detective Voss stood at the trailhead where his Subaru had been found 4 years earlier. The parking area was empty, the gravel track leading to it deteriorating further, nature slowly reclaiming even this small intrusion into its domain. She placed a memorial plaque on a large boulder near the trailhead, a simple bronze rectangle with Marcus's name, his dates, and a quote from his own field notes. "The forest keeps its secrets until it's ready to share them." She stood there for a long time, listening to wind in the trees, watching shadows move across the forest floor as clouds crossed the sun. She thought about Marcus's final words scratched on cave walls, about trails that weren't supposed to exist but did, about the possibility that humanity shared these mountains with something else, something that preferred to remain undefined and undocumented. And she thought about her own encounter that winter evening at the cave, that sound echoing through the ravine that could have been wind or animal or something else entirely. She'd filed no official report about it, mentioned it to no one, filed it away in the part of her mind reserved for things she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Some truths were too large to fit into incident reports and courtroom testimony. Some experiences changed how you understood the world in ways that couldn't be communicated to others who hadn't stood in that specific place, at that specific moment, and felt the weight of something watching from the darkness between trees. As she turned to leave, Detective Voss noticed something she hadn't seen when she arrived. On the other side of the boulder, partially hidden by overgrown grass, was a small pile of rocks arranged in a deliberate cairn. The stones were weathered, the arrangement probably old, but it was clearly intentional. A marker or memorial placed by someone who'd wanted to note this location, this threshold between known and unknown. She didn't disturb it. Some markers were meant to stand as warnings or remembrances, silent testimony to things that couldn't be spoken out loud. She simply acknowledged it with a nod, got in her truck, and drove back toward town, toward civilization, toward the world where mysteries had solutions and missing persons had causes of death that fit into neat categories. Behind her, the forest waited in silence, keeping its secrets as it had for millennia. And somewhere in those vast acres of Douglas fir and hemlock and cedar, along trails that appeared on no official maps, something else went about its existence, as it had long before humans arrived and would likely continue long after humans were gone. Marcus Davenport had gone looking for forgotten paths and found one that wasn't forgotten at all, just carefully hidden, jealously guarded, maintained by something that had learned over centuries how to remain legend rather than fact, story rather than science. He'd found what he was looking for, and it had cost him everything. But maybe, in those final days, as he sheltered in caves and traveled impossible distances despite broken legs, as something large and unknown made choices about his survival that he couldn't understand, maybe Marcus had also found something else. Evidence that the world was stranger and more mysterious than the map suggested. Proof that there were still wild things in wild places, still phenomena beyond human explanation, still moments of encounter between species that hadn't been named or categorized or stripped of their mystery by scientific inquiry. Was it worth the price he paid? That's not a question anyone else can answer. But Marcus chose to follow that trail, chose to document what he found, chose to push deeper into unknown territory because the unknowing drove him more than caution restrained him. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe the questions he left behind, the evidence he documented, the mystery he became part of, maybe that was its own kind of legacy, its own contribution to human understanding of the world we inhabit, but don't fully comprehend. The forest keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to venture far enough into the darkness, it shares them with you. And you have to decide whether you're ready for what those secrets might reveal about the world, about nature, about the thin line between known and unknown that we cross at our own risk. Marcus Davenport crossed that line, and 3 years later, his map showed us where he'd gone, following a trail that doesn't exist, except for those who know how to look for it, and who are willing to accept that some paths lead to places we weren't meant to find. The question isn't whether those places are real. The question is whether we're ready to accept what it means if they are.